Hey guys, Toby Mathis here, and today you're going to answer the question, do living trusts provide you any asset protection? So let's back way up, and before I answer that, I'm just going to talk about trusts in general. So number one is there's really three parties to any trust. It's grantor, it's trustee, and it's beneficiary. So I'm just going to draw it up here so you can follow it. So I always use a triangle, and so you have a grantor who's putting assets, I'll just put money, into the trust, and that's managed. Since the trust can't really own anything on its own accord, it has to own it through a trustee, somebody or something that's handling that. So we have our trustee who manages that asset for the benefit of, can you guess, a beneficiary, right? Or beneficiaries. All right. During your lifetime, so we call it a living trust. During your lifetime, you're going to be in all three positions. It's actually really simple. So we'll just say it's you. If you're married, then maybe it's you and a spouse. And then if something happens to you too, so let's just say that incapacitation or death, then you have a third party step in as the trustee. Family member, whatever. Could be a company, could be a trusted individual, could be a fiduciary, your lawyer, your accountant. Fill in the blank. But you're going to have somebody step into those shoes. Same thing here. During your lifetime, you're the primary beneficiary. It's you, your spouse, and then you leave instructions that it's either like, hey, I'm going to distribute everything to so-and-so when I pass, or to this organization, or hold it in trust until somebody's 40, you put all your conditions in there, whatever you want to do. So a lot of people have that same mentality of when I'm gone, I'm going to leave it to my kids, right? So maybe you're leaving it to your kids. Not my favorite, but you can absolutely do that. That's essentially what a trust is. Now, here's the big difference here. During your lifetime, this whole thing is what's called a revocable trust. And this equals no asset protection. None, zero. Unless there's a statute. I mean, your state could always say, hey, you know what? We're going to create a statute that makes living trusts have asset protection. There's no such thing right now. There is a land trust statute in Florida that gives protection, but the revocable trust, the easiest way to look at it is if I can change it, it means it's not truly in place. Somebody can go in there and come after me as the beneficiary, the grantor. They don't have to even have to name the living trust. They can just come after me and I am my trust during my lifetime. Now, somebody passes away, something magic happens. A portion of it now becomes irrevocable, which equals protection. And it's in a couple of different fashions. You have provisions, generally speaking, in a living trust that are going to say it's called credit shelter provisions. It's like, hey, if a beneficiary is subject to a court order or judgment or anything like that, don't distribute to them. There's also special needs provisions. Hey, if it's going to cause them to lose a state benefit, don't distribute to them. Those type of things are pretty common in a well-drafted document where it's saying, hey, if my beneficiary is in peril and compromised, don't give it to that beneficiary. If somebody's just going to take it, don't give it to them. And that's pretty common. Again, called a credit shelter provision. If you pass and you have a surviving spouse, there's another side to this. That portion of the estate, which if you're drafting it appropriately, half of that estate, so it may be, we dot this thing, becomes irrevocable. It can always be a portion, but I'm just going to use, for example, two spouses, half the estate gets locked down. The beneficiary remains your spouse, but it becomes irrevocable for their benefit. Let's just say it's the decedent. So I'm just going to put pass away. So somebody passes, the spouse is still the beneficiary of that trust that is left behind. The decedent's trust is going to point towards the beneficiary and say, hey, all right, during your lifetime, you get to be the beneficiary. There's other little things that you can tweak around with this. There's different types of trust, but I'm just using this as a great example. The reason that there's different types is because of estate tax issues. Right now, we have this monstrously high estate tax, so 99.9% of you guys don't have to worry about it. But just for sake of asset protection, this half becomes locked down. You now have those credit shelter provisions on that half. The second half that's still revocable means that the surviving spouse can change it, does not have asset protection. And they could change it. If they get remarried, they could leave it to their new spouse. If you want to lock down your half that says, hey, to your now spouse, something happens to you. If you want to make sure your kids are going to get their inheritance, you need to lock that down so that the spouse is a lifetime beneficiary, and then it would go to your family. Otherwise, you run the risk of disinheriting your family. Happens all the time, every day in this country. So again, if we didn't have a portion of it becomes irrevocable, let's just say you pass away and it automatically goes to the surviving spouse. Okay. Then there's no asset protection for it. And that surviving spouse has complete unfettered control over that asset. If that surviving spouse gets sued, if that surviving spouse gets remarried, all of those assets are going along with that surviving spouse. If you locked it down and half of it became irrevocable, or a portion of it became irrevocable, easiest way to think about this is now there is protection for it because that portion is no longer available to anybody that is the creditor of that spouse. That spouse still has the right to access the funds under certain circumstances. Usually the way these are drafted is you'd say, hey, use your money first, surviving spouse. And then if you need it, you have access to this money that's going to, for your lifetime, and then it's going to go to your kids. And you could even put in provisions that say, hey, if you ever get married, you got to do a prenup, and you have to recognize, the new spouse has to recognize that that's not their asset. Usually that's earmarked for kids. And it makes sense. Now, so you're asking, is this part of an asset protection plan? The easiest way I would say it is not really. Realistically, this is legacy planning. Asset protection planning, the use of LLCs, other types of protection vehicles, limited liability entities like limited partnerships and corporations, that's asset protection planning. And they do kind of go like this. They fit nicely together. Hey, I create my living trust, and it's going to hold, if you have a holding, for example, let's say you have a holding LLC and it's sitting in Wyoming. It's going to be owned by you as trustee of your trust. You and your spouse, one of you. If you have a corporation out here, your shares are held inside the trust. Easiest way to look at it is everything's being held by the trust because you want to say, here's where it goes. You could even put specific provisions in here like, hey, let's say you have one child that's really good in your, let's say it's real estate investing. So you have some other LLCs floating around out here holding a bunch of real estate, and they're all pointed towards this one holding LLC. And you have one child, let's say you have 3 kids, and one of them is really good on the real estate. You could say, hey, you know what? You're going to manage that real estate. Or you're going to get a little extra piece of that as part of what you put in your plan. You can absolutely do stuff like that. And say, if something happens to me, I don't want you guys to destroy what I built. I don't want you guys to undo it. The king of this was Ingvar, the founder of IKEA, right? IKEA, you can't get rid of IKEA. IKEA is actually charitable organizations own big chunks of it. IKEA itself is a charitable organization. His kids can't get rid of IKEA. He built it specifically to be that way, as I don't want you to undo my legacy. You could create the same thing. You could say, I have a business that we built up as a family. I want it to be there in 4 or 5 generations. The only way you're going to do that is through one of these vehicles called a legacy trust. Once it becomes irrevocable, you put in provisions that say, hey, you know what? The beneficiaries can't sell all the assets. The beneficiaries are the income beneficiaries, and they only get it if it's for health, education, maintenance, and support. Like you could put in there HEM standards or even less. You could say, hey, it's only there for college educations or higher education. That's the only thing it'd be used for. You guys get to manage the business, and it's all owned by this trust that's then just going on for hundreds of years for the benefit of your family for specific things. So does a living trust provide asset protection? No, not during your lifetime. When you pass, it creates a very, very nice vehicle for creating a legacy. And that's what I want to leave you with, is that the living trust is appropriate for legacy planning, not for tax planning, other than for the estate tax to a certain extent, not for asset protection, other than it does become irrevocable at some point and provide some credit shelter provisions for future beneficiaries. Like, so if you have kids and they go through a divorce or they get into a massive lawsuit, nobody can go in there and force distributions out of the living trust. It's not really there for any of those reasons, for business planning or anything else. It's really there for the legacy planning. And it's a very, very effective tool. And it does have other provisions. It has in there for health care, end of life decisions, a living will, HIPAA releases. So whomever you name as your healthcare power of attorney can actually get access to information so they can make good decisions for you. Same thing for the living will, so they can talk to the doctor or doctors. There's provisions in there for giving gifts, for memorial instructions, burial versus cremation, who takes care of minor children, who takes care of somebody who's your dependent. It can even be things like, hey, what happens for your animals? All that stuff is covered inside of a living trust. It's a wonderful vehicle for that. And I believe everybody needs an estate plan, period, full stop. Everybody could use a living trust. It's a very, very effective tool, but it is not an asset protection tool. Hey, if you like this type of information and believe somebody could benefit from it, please share it. If you would, please subscribe and like this video. If you click the little bell button, you'll get notified when new videos come out. And if you want something specific, if you have a specific question, put it in the comment section. I do respond to comments, but also that's where we get our ideas for our videos.